I'd like to pick up on something that John Hastie has said. I'm going to read it out. It's quite long, I'm afraid. Stop moaning about Brexit, Tim. Give it a rest, or at least tell all the truth. What about saying that we have not left the EU until we leave the ECHR? Why not mention the other countries in the EU are still suffering the same problems? Why not mention problems caused by all countries by COVID and immigration? Or, Tim, why not tell us about major investments in other EU countries? Tell us the benefits the countries in the EU have over us, except for the single market, which we all knew about and accepted it should be. All countries in Europe are suffering because of wars in the world and the failures of left-wing governments, but you grab at any chance to blame Brexit. These failings will continue until we have a common-sense leader in power, someone like Trump. You, Tim, are never happy until you get things your own way. Are you biting down on Brexit and Farage because you miss Braverman and Truss? Thank you very much for bringing up all the entertaining individuals. I don't think I'm biting down on anything. I don't. I don't think I'm biting down on anything, not even the pillow. But as for Brexit and the ECHR, I think that needs a little bit of unpacking, because although there were some Brexiteers like Michael Gove and Priti Patel who did raise leaving the ECHR in 2016 during the Brexit campaign, it wasn't a major feature. Calls to leave the ECHR have been raised since the early 2000s, and perhaps roots of opposition could be traced back to the 1998 Human Rights Act, which incorporated the ECHR into UK domestic law. Whether or not that should have happened is another matter entirely, but that's down to Tony Blair. And critics, particularly from the right, argue that this act gave excessive power to the courts, undermining parliamentary sovereignty, and facilitating legal challenges that conflict with government policies, particularly on immigration and national security. And complaints about the ECHR rulings on prisoner voting rights, for example, as in Hurst versus the UK in 2005, fueled calls for reform or withdrawal. The Conservative manifesto in 2015, during David Cameron's era, included a pledge to replace the Human Rights Act with a UK Bill of Rights, though outright withdrawal from the ECHR was not officially pursued. It wasn't really until 2022, in the Rwanda deportation case, that the ECHR became an issue for the Conservative Party and for the right wing, and was then attached sort of posthumously to the Brexit deal, when the ECHR issued a last-minute injunction blocking the deportation of asylum seekers to Rwanda, prompting renewed calls, particularly from Suella Braverman, to leave the convention. But the real problem is that the law that she produced, that law, the Nationality and Borders law, the illegal migration law, and then subsequently the Rwanda law, were all filled with error. They're all poorly drafted, and they are almost unworkable as laws, and I don't understand why the present government hasn't repealed them. It said it wasn't going to pursue Rwanda, so the logic of that is that it repeals the law. It hasn't done so, and that makes no sense to me. The Conservative hardliners from 2023 to 2025 and Reform UK, figures like Braverman, Robert Jenrick, Nigel Farage, have all argued that leaving the ECHR has been necessary to regain control over borders and national security, but they've come to it late. So it simply isn't true that it was part of the EU, and again that it was part of Brexit. The European Convention on Human Rights, the ECHR, is not an EU institution, but rather a treaty administered by the Council of Europe, which is itself entirely separate from the European Union. The EU is a political and economic union of 27 member states. The Council of Europe is a human rights or focused organisation with 46 member states, including non-EU countries like Turkey, Ukraine, and even, before its expulsion in 2022, Russia. The ECHR is a human rights treaty enforced by the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, and the EU has its own Charter of Fundamental Rights enforced by the Court of Justice and the European Union, the CJEU, in Luxembourg. And the UK left the jurisdiction of the CJEU, with Brexit, but remains bound by the ECHR, which predates EU membership. So people who opine about the ECHR and about Brexit are simply haven't done their history and haven't done their homework. The ECHR was drafted in 1950, post-World War II, under the guidance of British lawyers, including David Maxwell Fyfe. And the UK was one of the first signatories and ratified it in 1953, long before joining the EU in 1973. This means that leaving the EU had no automatic impact or effect on ECHR membership. And the Good Friday Agreement in 1988 requires the UK to adhere to the ECHR, making withdrawal politically fraught, particularly regarding Northern Ireland, which has suffered greatly because of Brexit. Leaving the ECHR could also complicate security cooperation with European states, particularly in extradition and policing. Calls to leave the ECHR gained momentum from 2000 onwards, and particularly from 2022, over issues like immigration and prisoner rights, but it became more pronounced post-Brexit because of frustrations over migration rulings. In other words, this is again, rather like the Northern Ireland, the Windsor Framework, a recognition that the people who were negotiating Brexit were twits and didn't know what they were doing and weren't good at their job. Because if they were good at their job and if the ECHR was a problem, it would have been there in the paperwork at the beginning. It wasn't. And just as Lord Frost and the other twits who were negotiating got that wrong, they got other things wrong as well. The migration problem is entirely of their making. The Dublin Protocol failure is entirely of their making since Brexit. And although the Dublin Protocol may not have been perfect, and was far from perfect, seeing Brexit as an opportunity to renegotiate something that would have worked for us, for Europe, would have been an excellent idea. And when Rishi Sunak came into power, the first thing he should have done was to organise an international conference to renegotiate and redefine the 1951 Refugee Convention, but he didn't do that. Instead, he was waylaid by twits like Suella Braverman into this Rwanda fantasy and wasting a lot of money that could have been given where? Well, it could have been put into the NHS. We have been led by twits or led by donkeys. I don't really care which metaphor is best used. But the ECHR is a separate legal framework under the Council of Europe, meaning that Brexit has no impact on UK membership, and leaving the ECHR would require an entirely separate decision with its own legal and diplomatic consequences. There are many other reasons why you could say that Brexit was not properly implemented, and I agree, but the ECHR is not one of them.